Welcome to Sweeter Than Honey. Today's daily devotion is from Genesis 13. Genesis 13 tells us about failure, about how to recover from failure. There are some people that are well known who, at one point in their lives, were considered to be grand failures. J.K. Rowling's, the author of Harry Potter, at one point in her life was a grand failure. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Albert Einstein, Michael Jordan, all of these men and women had moments in their lives where, if you'd have counted them and their success rate at that point, they would have been considered grand failures. One other failure was a man by the name of Abraham. Abraham is discussed to us in Genesis 13. Genesis 13 tells us about a failure that might hit home with some of us. I completely relate to Abraham's spiritual failure. Although I did not fail in the exact same way as Abraham, I have failed spiritually time and time again. Abraham had taken Sarah, and at this point his name's just Abram. Abram and Sarai, his wife, were down in Egypt, and he failed to trust the Lord. He lied about his relationship with Sarai and had disrupted the house of Pharaoh and brought shame to his own home and to the name of the Lord. As the chapter unfolds, it is easily divided into three sections. Verses 1 through 7 tell about God blessing Abraham, even though Abraham, or Abram, at that point had failed. In verses 8 through 13, we are told of a split between Abram and Lot. And from verses 14 through 18, there is a visitation from the Lord reassuring Abram that God is still faithful to his covenant promises. Beginning with verse 1, so Abram went up from Egypt, and that is where he failed. And it's almost like Egypt is this cloud hanging over him. And there are times where you fail and you feel like there's a spiritual weight, a thundercloud of spiritual failure hanging over you and identifying you as a failure. He and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold, and he journeyed from the land of Negeb, from the Negeb, as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And it's a great thing whenever we feel like failures to go to an appointed place, but wherever we are, to call upon the Lord. And that's what Abram does. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Drop down to verse 8. And Abram said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right, then I will go to the left. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the Jordan Valley was well watered, everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself. That's very important. Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, and Lot settled in the cities of the valley. and moved his tent as far as Sodom. And the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. As Abram is experiencing this failure, he recognizes that his failure has made him unworthy of what God has called him to do. And so Abram takes one of basically three options. There are basically three options that you can choose from once you fail. You can either blame others, give up, or take responsibility and try to piece things together and start over. Abram, at this point, it seems to me, is choosing for option number 2. There's no blaming anyone else. He was the only one to blame. But he, in his mind and his heart, are basically giving up. That's why it seems to me that he is giving Lot the choice. He knows that he's where God is wanting them to be, and he says, well, God's not going to use me anymore. Maybe he'll use Lot. Lot, you choose. You pick whichever way you want to go. I think that this is Abram essentially giving up before the Lord. And Lot chooses, and he chooses something of a selfish path. This was not his covenant, it's Abram's covenant. Abram is the leader. He is not appropriate deferential here, but instead he chooses for himself. And then we get to verse 14. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. I want you to notice a couple of things about this paragraph. Notice that it is God who approaches Abram. God comes to him, and God reminds Abram of what he has promised him. And then God reminds him with three statements. In verses 15, 16, and 17, these three successive verses, he says, I will, I will, I will. In other words, Abram, the keeping of this covenant, the accomplishment of my will is not something that you are going to do, but it is something that I will do. And that is what we need to remember in our lives as God is working. He is not trying to. His work is not about you; it is through you. God is not working His will centered upon you, but He is working His will through you. He is using you, and that is our great opportunity. You see this divine determination that God has a plan that He's going to accomplish, and we are invited to take place in this, even with all of our baggage, even with our current failures, our repeated failures. God allows us to be part of what He is doing. Have you failed? Good news. God is a God who uses failures. Notice also the difference between Lot, who settles his tent toward Sodom, and Abram, who moves his tents toward Mamre and Hebron, and it is there that he centers his thoughts not on the wicked men of Sodom, but on the holiness of God. And there he builds an altar to the Lord. What are you going to do when you fail? If you're going to recover from failure, you need to remember God's promise. You need to trust God's strength, and you need to obey God's command. Wherever you are and whatever you have failed to do, God uses failures. And Abram is a great example of that principle. May God bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you and give you peace.